Good afternoon. My name is Don Gibson, and along with Tom Axworthy, I coordinate these panels on ethics for Massey College. As we begin, I want to share with you the land acknowledgement. Massey College is built on land where many Indigenous peoples have lived. It is on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, as well as the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee peoples. We want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward the land and the great privilege that we have to work on this land. I really want to welcome our three panelists today, and I'll just take a brief moment or two to introduce them. Our first panelist is Nathaniel Nate Erskine Smith, a member of Parliament for Beaches, East York, first elected in 2015. Known for his advocacy and legislative work, he has sponsored numerous private members' bills and served on key parliamentary committees, including Public Safety and Canada-China Relations. A lawyer by training, he previously worked in public interest law. Nate hosts the podcast Uncommons, exploring Canadian politics, and is passionate about progressive solutions to social change, including climate change and social justice. And then we have Marianne Lehe-Luna is a Massey College Junior Fellow and a PhD candidate in Human Geography and Planning at the University of Toronto, researching the intersections of housing, food security, and climate impacts on the Latin immigrants of Toronto. She's worked with organizations like the UN, Canadian Red Cross, and co-founded an NGO which promotes menstrual health and sustainability for women in South America. With a background in environmental public health, Marianne's work reflects her commitment to addressing systemic inequalities around climate change, housing crisis, and global health changes. And then finally, we have Dr. James Orbinski, who is actually the incoming principal of Massey College. So we're really delighted to have you here, a professor at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Medicine with expertise in global health and humanitarian ethics. A former president of Doctors Without Borders, he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize on their behalf as he led the international efforts on medical relief, climate health advocacy. As a founding director of York University's Institute for Global Health Research, he's renowned for research on global health, governance, humanitarian aid, and the health impacts of climate change. Well, thank you all very, very much for joining us today. To set the stage, I want to begin. The topic is lending a helping hand, climate change, global conflicts, and humanitarian aid. I'm going to begin with an assumption, and that is that I believe that most people in our society feel it's at least at some level important to lend a helping hand to others. Now, with global warming and conflicts, there's a growing need for humanitarian aid. One wonders how we can possibly meet the increased demands and needs. I mean, just in Canada, we think about the increase in forest fires and the impact that has on individuals, and to say nothing of various levels of governments, just at the cost level alone, or food banks. I mean, we're seeing an incredible increase in needs of food banks, and our food banks are tapped out donor wise. I mean, they've kind of reached a level, and yet there's more and more demand. Can they get higher in that kind of level to be able to meet more needs? Recently, the mayor of Toronto met with a group of religious leaders to discuss the issue of homelessness and how to deal with encampments. I don't want to talk about that issue, but the Toronto Star headline of that event really caught my attention in regards to this conversation. The headline was, "We have a duty to serve the needy." I began a sense of lending a helping hand. There's a question about duty obligation. The increased need for aid raises questions of institutional readiness and effectiveness of governments and nonprofit organizations. What do we do well? What do we need to do better? Are Canadians rethinking how much we can and should do? Are we less willing to lend the proverbial helping hand? Humanitarian need in a time of increasing need. I'm going to turn it over to James.
Well, thank you, Don. And first of all, I'd just like to say what an honor it is to be on this panel with the other panelists. Obviously, my fellow panelists or co-panelists are deeply engaged within their communities, either as politicians or as activists, and also deeply engaged academically, intellectually, from a policy perspective. And in my mind, that convergence of politics, civil society, and engaging a broad sector of actors across society, this is the essence of the pursuit of the public good. And the pursuit of the public good is core. It is, in fact, the mission of Massey College. So it's very much my pleasure to be part of this panel. Don, your question around growing needs within our own communities and then globally, I think it's a question of how we understand charity versus duty. I think in normal circumstances, when a person or a subgroup of a community are in need, one can rely on charity as a way of responding to that person's need. But in abnormal circumstances, where there is truly a crisis, a disaster, a crisis, or a catastrophic event, charity is simply not enough. Charity is a choice. And in situations of crisis, disaster, or catastrophe, a community has moved beyond its normal bounds and its normal degrees of freedom to exercise charity or not. Some threat has become manifest, creating extremely abnormal circumstances that literally change the story. Which is what the word catastrophe is the etymology of catastrophe is about the story, an event that changes the story. We're at a stage now, Don, globally, where we have a massive increase in the direct impacts of climate change on human societies. We're also at a stage where we are literally at the beginning of those impacts. We know that greenhouse gas emissions of 30 years ago are what create the causes and conditions for extreme weather events 30 years subsequently. So what we're seeing today is the effect of greenhouse gas emissions from 30 years ago. What we will see over the coming 30 years are the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions over the last 30 years, which have been on a steady increase. What we're experiencing globally in terms of extreme weather events alone is genuinely catastrophic for many communities around the world. In that context, we have to move beyond charity. It is our human responsibility to each other to assist those who are in distress. And I think I would also like to just say that we should actually move the moral conversation out of the realm of consideration, out of the realm of option. And what I would suggest to you is that, in fact, it is wise self-interest to be concerned about the welfare of others in situations of catastrophe or extreme emergency. What happens elsewhere in such circumstances will affect us socially, politically, economically, in terms of geopolitical stability, and so on. And so it is very much in our wise self-interest to engage meaningfully in helping communities and nations, and particularly those in the South, adapt effectively and urgently to the impacts of climate change.
Thank you. Mary Ann, please.
Thank you so much, Don. And thank you, James. Those are really insightful points to make. So, Don, the way that I interpreted your question was sort of, I wanted to take a closer look at what Canada's role should be in addressing humanitarian crises in this moment of climate change. And so oftentimes when we think of Canada as being a leader in humanitarian aid and having humanitarian policies enshrined in our different foreign policies. However, if we take a closer look at climate-related humanitarian crises, Canada should not only feel compelled, but also take a greater responsibility to address these issues. And there's a few reasons why I think this. Firstly, for those of you who don't know, Canada is actually the 10th largest emitter of carbon dioxide globally, despite only having 0.5% of the world's population. And so this represents a pretty significant percentage of total global emissions for just one emitter. And the bulk of our emissions do come from sectors such as oil and gas. So the results of our continued and increasing emissions of greenhouse gases exacerbates events, as we all know, such as wildfires, flooding, droughts, and extreme storms, all of which we know are disastrous for the environment and also the inhabitants. So we know that this relationship exists. We also know that the UNHCR has told us that approximately 20 million people are displaced every year due to climate-related events, and this figure is only set to rise. And it is projected that by 2050, climate change could create as many as 200 million climate refugees globally. And these numbers are quite staggering. And so, without a significant and transformative shift in how we produce and consume energy, and without a clear implementation of our commitments to carbon neutrality, as has been previously signed in the Paris Agreements, where Canada agreed to work towards a net zero emissions by 2050, we will continue to be contributing to this climate-induced displacement that we're witnessing around the world. So we do know that Canada has provided 1.3 billion in humanitarian aid assistance, and this was in between 2022 and 2023. Although the exact number for climate-related humanitarian assistance is not clear, we can assume it's a large number. So therefore, without sort of a paradigm shift in the way that we're operating, we are simply perpetuating an unsustainable cycle where, on one hand, yes, we are contributing and being benevolent and altruistic by providing this assistance. But on the other hand, we are simultaneously contributing, and in a pretty significant manner, to the root cause of this displacement. And so I think there's a cognitive dissonance there that we need to fundamentally address. There's a few ways in humanitarian aid response that Canada or strategies that Canada can take to be a little bit more sustainable, such as green responses. And so I have a little bit of familiarity and experience with green responses, but essentially they aim to conduct projects in a way that doesn't cause more harm to the local environment and minimize any contribution to further climate change. However, even though these sort of sustainability initiatives are really important, the onus should never be on these individuals or these types of projects to single-handedly work towards reducing emissions or reducing the root cause of these humanitarian aids. We know that the responsibility must lie on the private sector and on our national policies to make changes. And we have an indisputable amount of evidence that shows the linkage between our own actions and climate change. And therefore, I think that these are the next steps that Canada should take to address this humanitarian crisis.
Thank you. Nate, if we could hear from you, please.
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me. And second, to answer your question, I think there is obviously a moral responsibility to help those in need. And when I think of climate action in particular, it's not only helping those in need, it's also ensuring that we're responsible stewards, and we're looking after future generations as well. And there's a moral responsibility in that regard too. I would echo the point that James made, though, that there are those who might disagree with that. And so then there has to be, I think, an appeal to the evidence and an appeal to individual self-interest to say, if we don't deliver, if we don't play our part, if we don't significantly increase support in particular areas where there are these collective action problems, and that's what climate change is. It is a collective action problem, and we need governments to act. We need governments across countries to act collectively and together to act. And so if we don't do that, we are going to have increased challenges in a really problematic way that is going to ultimately cost us much more. And the encampment issue is an interesting it's an interesting example you raise, because there's an issue that the underinvestment in social housing in particular over the last 20 plus years has led us to a place, in part, that we are struggling to cope with an increase in homelessness and encampments. And people come at it from a compassionate lens, or people come at it from a small business lens in terms of protecting main streets. Regardless, people want this resolved, and politicians are now scrambling, I think, to resolve this, instead of taking a long-term view in the best interests of those in need, and in the best interest of not only protecting the vulnerable, but ensuring we're not confronting, not allowing something to get to a crisis level. And when you look at climate change as a parallel on the international stage, here we have a situation where Canada contributes to a great degree on a per capita basis, as Marianne mentioned, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Well, we also know that we have a role to play, and there's lots of domestic action that we're undertaking. That's a good thing. But when you think of the impact we could and should have on the world stage, we should know that there is, as an example, a global goal across developed countries to deploy $100 billion USD a year. Okay, how much does Canada contribute? Canada contributes more than governments have in the past, sure. We can pat ourselves on the back. That's great, but we only contribute about $1 billion Canadian a year. It's that total fund on a Canadian level is $140 billion. We contribute $1 billion, or about $1 billion a year, out of a total package of $140 billion. That is not doing our part, I would argue, when you think of the developed country they are, the wealth that we have as a country, and what we should be contributing to this collective action problem that the world faces. And so, yes, we have a moral responsibility, number one, but two, just on that question of where we can take action today to prevent a challenge that is otherwise going to grow into an absolute crisis. It's not only a moral responsibility; it's in our own best interests.
Right, thank you. I'm just going to ask briefly each of you as a panel. We've been talking about the climate change primarily. Also interested in your observations, just quite briefly, about the impact of global conflicts on the need for humanitarian aid. So, James, if we come back to you, just helpful. Thank you.
Well, I think it's in the first instance, it's important to understand conceptually that a changing climate amplifies or makes worse the fragile circumstances of countries or states that are experiencing some kind of political uncertainty. And so the effects of climate change amplify or make worse the causes and conditions that exist in fragile states. And so we have seen this already in Darfur in the early part of this century. We have seen this in Syria. Prolonged drought in northern Syria led to displacement of people within Syria. People moved to cities in different regions, and the people who moved were of different ethnicities than the people who lived in those host cities. And this caused a disruption, which allowed for nefarious actors to destabilize the political reality of Syria, and it upset the structure, the political structure that Syria existed in under very difficult circumstances. That then led to civil war. So that relationship between climate change amplifying previous fragilities within a society that can lead to conflict, or that can lead to the consequences of conflict. For example, the movement of people both internally and across borders as refugees. That relationship is very important that we understand that. So we see this, for example, in the Chad Basin now in Africa. We've seen this in Somalia, where, for example, prolonged drought, the longest drought in the country's history, in 2023, left 6 million people food insecure. And we also see this in many different parts of the world. So the people who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change generally live in fragile states. And so there's now a worsening dynamic between climate change and fragile states. We see war and displacement. We see food insecurity. So we see crop failures and famine. And we see the emergence or reemergence of certain infectious diseases. And we know today that we are experiencing the highest number of people in need ever recorded. So, according to the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs of the UN, there's more than 360 million people in need of direct humanitarian assistance today. We've never seen numbers like that before. The funding for humanitarian assistance is abysmally low. The minimum amount of money that is required to even begin to meet the basic needs of not that full number, but only roughly around 60% of that 360 million people. The basic amount of money that we need is $48 billion to provide humanitarian assistance to those people. Less than 25% of that 48 billion is actually realized, right? So UN agencies, NGOs, and others are operating on a quarter of what they actually need, less than a quarter of what they actually need to meet people's needs. And the point that Marianne made earlier, that we are going to see a massive increase in the number of people who are internally displaced within countries, and a massive increase in the number of people who become refugees or who cross state borders. This is inevitable to the impacts of climate change if we do not take a different approach, right? And so again, it is wise self-interest to deal with the very basic humanitarian needs of people today, so that we prevent or reduce the chance of major geopolitical instability as a consequence of the movement of people, as the consequence of famine, as the consequence of war, and so on. Again, the key point for us to really recognize is that climate change amplifies or makes worse the causes and conditions that exist in fragile states. And there are very direct consequences of that.
Thank you. Marianne.
Yeah, so I think I would just have to add on to what James has said. It's exactly that. I think climate change is a key risk to global peace and stability, and essentially it's increasing the likelihood of conflict. Not only that, we know that war itself can contribute to climate change. With the other examples that have been previously mentioned, we know that climate change also is able to, there's a strong relationship between deadly conflicts, and especially in context, and this is obviously very context specific, but it's undeniable that it's a threat to in multiple stages. It can cause increased food insecurity, water scarcity, and water resources, and as well as deforestation. And so, yeah, there's not much more to add than what James had already said, but it's crucial to take into consideration and understand the key role that addressing climate change will have in ensuring a conflict-free world.
Thank you. Nate, please.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of where I can constructively add to what was already said. But I would say, I suppose that when you think of, there's no doubt, to James's point, we were insufficiently funding development assistance, and then global conflict has only made the demand that much stronger, and we are ill-equipped as a result to deal with that, because we were ill-equipped to deal with the prevailing challenge as it was. And we see, take our immigration system, for example. There's only so much capacity, and on the humanitarian front, there's been great strides in expanding humanitarian intake. I think last year it was over 80,000 people that were part of the permanent levels that were invited and settled on humanitarian and compassionate grounds. But that is a small drop in the bucket in terms of the global challenge. You look at the development assistance that Canada and other countries contribute. There's a small dent in the overall challenge, and at a time when things are only getting worse, be it because of climate change or global conflict. And so I think in the same way we've talked about, especially around climate, that the answer has to be looking at this from a more preventative focus, a longer term. Investments now are going to pay off, and not only the short term in some ways, but certainly in the medium to long term. I think we have to take the same when you insert global conflict into the conversation. I think we should have the same outlook that people will sometimes see that says sending money overseas, and it can be hard politics. You're at the doorstep and someone says, why don't you look after vulnerable seniors here instead of sending our money overseas to God knows where. And I think in answer to that, it's about what is going to make the world more secure, what's going to make sure that Canada as a country is secure in that world, and it is making sure that we take that long-term perspective. And how do you deliver stability and peace? It oftentimes is through a really focused and concerted effort around development assistance, and whether that is efforts to advance democracy and human rights, whether that is efforts to alleviate poverty, whether that is efforts to respond to a crisis situation, or efforts to combat climate change. That we do have to take a more serious and thoughtful look at the long term in terms of our interests and in the world's interests, in terms of how do we deliver the stability, peace, and security that we want to see.
Thank you. Well, so far, thank you. This has been really terrific. I want to give all of you on the panel an opportunity to respond or pick up perhaps on something that somebody else has offered, or just some comments or affirmation of. So I'm just going to open it to whoever would want to kind of jump in and pick up any comment on what you've heard.
Can I maybe challenge? So I struggle with this in politics, right? So we make a grand promise in the last election to say we're going to increase development assistance every single year, and then we don't do it. And even when we do increase it, we're increasing it barely to keep pace with inflation as it stands. So if you think of that Pearsonian target of 0.7%, we are less than half of that, and we've made no sizable dent. And so I guess the politics that intervene here, you've got a Liberal government that is struggling, even despite those promises and commitments, or the commitments that we haven't even fully delivered on. You have a Conservative opposition that is more, certainly more popular at the moment, at least, that is saying they're going to slash development assistance in order to fund defense. Not to say we shouldn't fund defense, but surely we should do both, especially as it relates to our security. So I would be very interested in hearing from my co-panelists in terms of how one can best bring Canadians along to ensure there is the political will to deliver on what the evidence tells us we need to do, what our moral obligations tell us we need to do, but our politics intervenes to push back against, and how we bring Canadians along to do what we need to do.
Anybody like to respond to that?
Go ahead, Marianne.
Wow. I mean, it's a tough question. I think that oftentimes, and maybe rightfully so, there's a little bit of lack of trust in politicians in terms of being able to deliver on these promises. And oftentimes there's quite a gap between academics and scientists and those who bring forward the evidence and those who then have to work on implementing it. And so I think just working towards maybe knowledge mobilization and strengthening those partnerships where there is stronger trust and stronger faith that, yes, the research that we're putting out there is going to be able to contribute to changes, not only globally, but also here at home in Canada.
Yeah. Nate, I think it's a great question. And it's a question that is relevant, obviously, domestically here in Canada. But it's also a question that's relevant everywhere in the world. I think, from the 1992 Rio summit all the way up to today, I would have to say that, in my estimation, um, while there have been wonderful successes in the around identifying, characterizing, and then defining an approach to global warming, um, those successes including the Paris Agreement, those successes including um, the ongoing COP, or Conference of the Parties annual meetings. Um, are you still hearing me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. There have been major successes, but I think even with those successes, the greatest failure from 1992 all the way up really to today is a failure of storytelling, right? I think the way in which the evidence has been presented has been overly scientific, overly technical, overly driven by a techno-scientific narrative that does not tell a story. And most people, um, just turn off. I think there's often a misconception that people don't get it, or people aren't smart enough to understand it. The average Canadian turns every single day to the sports page and looks at batting averages, earned run averages, hit rates, and so on. These are very complex statistical concepts, right? But for somebody to tell me that people aren't smart enough, that the average Canadian is not smart enough to understand complex issues, I think that is a complete misunderstanding of what intelligence is. So I think it also is a misunderstanding of the failure to tell a meaningful story, right? So the other sort of piece of the story, if you will, or narrative, because it's not really a story, the other piece of the narrative that has been told since 92 right up until today is that the world is going to end, right? That the coming catastrophe, the coming disaster, the coming disruption, the coming end of life as we know it. And what that has done is it has terrified people. So people are either baffled by meaningless data, or they have been terrified. And they stand like a deer caught in the headlights, not knowing what to do. So I think that the big challenge is the challenge of storytelling, and telling the story, the reality of climate change and what it means, and also telling a story that helps us choose how we are going to adapt, right? That I think is the key political challenge, and these are the challenges of one of the key challenges of the political arts, right? Is storytelling and engaging and listening and communicating and capturing the essence of people's feelings and their questions, and then shaping and moving forward, offering real, meaningful stories that help people find themselves in that story and help them make their choices about how they are going to act and adapt and so on. That's my main kind of reaction to Don's really powerful question.
And can I add just a small thing?
James, I'm a preacher, and you just delivered a really good seminar on preaching. So thank you. I come out of a social gospel, social justice tradition, and I read all three of your bios, and your commitment and passion for social justice just jumps right off the page. And I find, first of all, that very encouraging. It's really good to see that. I want to kind of shift a little bit and really kind of maybe focus on the question of willingness. I think there's a perhaps a climate within our society that is rethinking how much we can do, whether it be climate change directly or humanitarian aid. I think some people are talking about looking after ourselves perhaps more than others. And so I want to just hear from you as people who are committed to social justice, what you're sensing, what you're seeing, what your concerns are about this whole concern for social justice at this point. So I'll let anybody who wants to jump in. We don't have to go in order.
I mean, I can start there. I mean, I think to your earlier question where you drew in the Toronto Star article around encampments and homelessness, there are so many stories we are bombarded with of people in need, and then there is this sense of, do we have the capacity to help everyone that we want to help, and that we feel this sense of moral responsibility to help, and that's even on a domestic level, let alone you get to international level, and obviously when I think about the push and pull of politics, people rightly say, well, we've got to make sure people are looked after. If there's a veteran on the street, we've got to make sure that that individual is looked after. And sending money overseas to something that feels very far away. Now, social media has made it feel much closer at different times, for sure. But that's still the imperative for many is to say, make sure that we're helping those here first. And I think the pendulum is swinging to some extent, at least, to that sort of, domestic first approach. And we need to make sure, I think we do two things in response to that. One is, yes, of course, we should look after those in need here at home. That should hopefully go without saying. We need to act on that and show results. And the other part, to James's point around storytelling, I think we do have to deliver a more powerful story as to why is it we need to play a stronger role on the world stage. And there are different stories that will speak to different people. So, when I'm knocking doors and someone says, what are you doing sending money overseas for climate? What is this? And yeah, I could talk about climate finance, and I could start as I did with, the insufficiency of one small part of this and $1 billion out of 140 billion. I could also talk about protecting the rainforests in the Amazon. And that is a much more powerful story for many people to say, oh, Canada can play a role in helping to protect the Amazon. Well, that's something that I think is important when it comes to something that is very visible, very important to, and people know. And so I do think attaching the overall programs to particular, whether it's particular projects or particular stories that speak to many people across the political spectrum is incredibly important. And the only thing I would add to the storytelling piece, it's hard to tell successful stories if we don't measure results and we don't articulate those results. So if we are only making announcements to say we're sending X billions of dollars here, we're sending X millions of dollars there, X billions of dollars here and there. So if that's the only message we are delivering in politics, we are not going to bring people along, and we aren't going to deliver the social justice we need to deliver on the world stage. And we should be measuring results, whether it is infectious diseases that we're addressing and the number of lives we're saving from tuberculosis or from malaria, if it's the number of individuals we have rescued from certain conflict zones, whatever the case might be, the dollars have to match to a particular outcome. I think if we're going to continue to be successful in increasing those dollars and ultimately increasing more successful outcomes.
Marianne, do you want to?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just jump in. I think that it's a really good point that you're bringing up this the concept of social justice, because we know that climate justice and social justice are linked, basically. Climate justice obviously recognizes how climate change has impacts on community, which have already been made vulnerable by social, economic, and health and other impacts, and who have contributed, in most of the cases, these communities are those that have contributed the least to climate change. And in turn, climate change is then worsening their existence. If we take a look at those in Canada who are that we know are most impacted by climate change, it's BIPOC communities and Indigenous communities, and we know that their access to clean water and their ability to preserve sustainable cultural practices are all being threatened by climate change and changing weather patterns and sea ice and wildlife populations. And so yeah, I think just taking a look at what's happening here and within our own communities is crucial.
James.
Yeah, I would say that just around the question of social justice and how that is manifest today, I would say that there have been major changes in the form of engagement in pursuit of social justice over the last 30 or 40 years. There's no question about that. But I would also say that, I work with young people every day. I have the great privilege of being a professor and working with undergraduate students, with graduate students. Also at Massey, I have the great privilege of interacting with politicians, with major business leaders, NGO leaders, and so on. And what I would say is that most especially among youth and young people, I have rarely experienced over my lifetime a deeper commitment to social justice. That commitment is very much alive and very much a driving force among young people. And that is manifest in people's approach to work, for example. People want to choose jobs and work that are meaningful to them personally, but also meaningful or make a contribution to our society. And that is a real clear change, a generational change in how youth describe their approach to work and also their approach to their citizenship within society. I'd also say that we have many, many challenges that drive the kind of polarization of societies, not just ours, but many societies. And social media, for example, has been a driving force in creating bubble communities where we only hear what we like to hear, and we don't hear counter perspectives, and we don't have to formulate in our own mind a story that allows us to understand how best to engage in the world. But I would say that as well, there's as Marianne has pointed out, there's a decreased trust in government, a decreased trust in so-called experts. But it's quite important that we recognize that the core elements and the core kind of drivers of the pursuit of social justice are very much alive. The question is, what form will they take, right? How can they be brought together to drive meaningful policy change, meaningful political change, and meaningful efforts to address some of the truly egregious inequities that exist in our own society in Canada, but also internationally. And in the context of today's conversation, how can we do that in a way that, excuse me, just makes it so self-evident that it is genuinely wise self-interest to look after and to support communities that are truly, truly impacted today by climate change, and so that they can adapt more effectively. That helps us. It is very much in our self-interest. And the last thing I just say, Don, is that we don't, we can't separate Canada from the rest of the world. We can't separate Canada from the biosphere. We do not live in a bubble. And the challenge for us is that the narratives and the kind of social media tools and the consequences of some of the major political changes over the last 15 years or so, they kind of create this illusionary bubble. But we do not live in a bubble. We cannot separate ourselves from the biosphere. We cannot separate ourselves from what is happening between other nations in terms of conflict, in terms of governance, in terms of infectious disease control. For example, COVID is a very good example. We could not separate ourselves from the reality of what was happening in the rest of the world, both in terms of the cause of COVID and also in terms of the response to contain, control, and mitigate. But I think that's really the big challenge of social justice: how to break the illusion of the bubble, right? It's not a lack of will, it's not a lack of desire, and most especially among young people. It's very much alive. The question is how to break through that bubble.
Well, I'm going to pick up on that. That I like the image of breaking through that bubble, and you can jump in, any of you, in a minute, where you see something positive that's having an impact that is breaking that bubble. Be interesting to hear your observations on that.
I don't want to dominate, but I've got lots of positive news for you.
That's good.
Well, look, there are global transnational NGOs, MSF, Oxfam, World Vision, CARE, and a whole slew of others that are deeply engaged on these issues. And they're deeply, deeply engaged at a very practical grassroots level around the world, providing real assistance for real adaptation choices that communities are faced with. The Red Cross has one of the most up-to-date, in fact, I think it is the leading scientific entity that looks very specifically at how to help communities adapt to the impacts of climate change in terms of food security, in terms of disaster risk reduction, in terms of ensuring supply chains to, for example, health systems and clinics, and so on. MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, recognizes very much the reality of how climate change amplifies conflict and amplifies insecurity, and is adapting its programs and its interventions to help communities cope with the reality of climate change. There are major foundations like the Berghoff Foundation that is run by a man, Andrew Gilmore, who was a former UN Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights. That his foundation is focused on environmental peace building. So working in nations and or communities where environmental fragility interacts with social and political fragility, and where through his foundation they are actively providing and testing different solutions and strategies around how to adapt more appropriately. So there are myriad initiatives, and then there are within academia around the world, not simply here in Canada, but Canada is actually way behind what's happening in other parts of the world. In academia, there's a very clear focus on what I describe as critical problem solving for greater effectiveness and greater equity and greater excellence in climate policies and programs that genuinely help nations adapt. So there's all kinds of stuff going on. And our challenge here in Canada is to tell that story and ask ourselves, how are we going to participate in that story? Because that participation, it is wise self-interest to be concerned about the welfare of others. And so there are many, many things going on, and it's very easy to get kind of despairing or to fall into a spiral of despair when one looks at even just the most recent outcome of the COP meeting. There was not the magical $100 billion. It didn't appear, right? And it's put off until next year, and so on and so on. But I think it's very important to keep the story of how we are adapting and coping and responding to climate change, to keep it in a broad perspective. I mentioned earlier the Rio Summit of '92. Well, from '92 until 2024, that's 32 years. Now, people may say, oh, that's a very long time. But in human history, we have never, ever so quickly come to a place where we have a common understanding of a challenge of the global commons, and where we have developed an approach that is deeply imperfect, and we are staggering our way, sometimes 2 steps forward, sometimes 1 step back, sometimes 1 step forward, sometimes 2 steps back, but we are moving forward in defining meaningful solutions. I think of, for example, I'll stop in a moment after this little story. I think of the abolition of the slave trade. That idea, the idea that slavery was not good, that idea emerged in the mid 16th century. And it took 350 years for that idea to spread and to permeate and to percolate into political structures and into law and legislation that has literally changed the way we see each other as human beings, right? Now that 350-year process, even that is a very fast process when you think about the complexity of human societies and civilizations. The same can be said for the emergence of women's rights. The same can be said for the emergence of child rights. The same can be said for the emergence of labor rights. With each of those examples, that period of time has become shorter and shorter and shorter. And here we are, from 1992 until today, we now have a absolutely laser sharp, clear understanding of the nature of the problem of global warming and what its impacts are. And we also have a process, and again, imperfect and staggering forward and staggering back, but we have a process for moving forward, and we have a process in a context of changing politics. So I am deeply actually hopeful about the future, that we are moving forward. We must move faster, and Canada must up its game. It must engage. It must break through the bubble that we are living in, a bubble that we, in many ways, have contributed to, and we have to make greater and more significant contributions to the global effort, because, again, it's wise self-interest to be concerned about the welfare of others.
James, I can't help but when you're talking about that process of time, I can't help, and you mentioned slavery, I can't help but think of William Wilberforce. Year after year after year after year, he introduced private members to the British House, and it took decades and decades, and he never stopped. And eventually, they passed a bill that ended slave trade in the British Empire. Nate, just any quick observation about some positive stuff?
Right. So I would identify something positive. I would identify some challenge, some challenges ahead, and maybe speak to how we might want to overcome those challenges. Because on the positive front, I'll use an example that is close to home, but we have the makings of a youth climate corps. It was a call to action across party lines between the Liberals and NDP, and it was in the last budget. And there's currently work underway to realize that initiative and to really engage young people in not only people who are concerned about the problem, but providing an outlet so that young people can also be a solution to the problem that is climate change. And so I think that's a really positive story, and we'll continue to see that positive story unfold, I hope. Now, the challenge, though, and I mentioned the pendulum swinging, and I know, James has just talked about a long arc to history, and his conclusion is probably the correct one, which that it bends towards justice, and that's right. But I would say we don't have unlimited time on all issues, and so on this issue, I don't know that we have the amount of time that it might take or has taken on some other notable social justice and injustices. So the challenge, look at how the pendulum swinging. We're seeing, I'm a Liberal member of Parliament. We see the Liberal government cutting back on immigration, and that is necessary on temporary immigration, but it's impacted permanent levels, which is going to impact our intake on. No one's really talked about this, but it is going to impact in a negative way our intake on the humanitarian compassionate side of things. So we're seeing a scaling back on. In terms of meeting our moral obligation, we're going to see, we already see insufficient climate finance. We're going to see less of that going forward. I think we are already, rightly, James and Marianne have articulated sort of the need, the collective need. We aren't delivering anywhere close to that, meeting that collective need as it is, and I think we're going to see a turn towards a more insular-looking federal government in the near future. I don't wish for this, but I think that's likely. And so when you look at all of this, we are going to see the pendulum swing. And so what's the answer to that challenge? Well, the answer to that challenge is, I think, James has told a very positive story about young people caring. I think that's exactly right. But how we direct our efforts really matters. And so the Youth Climate Corps is an outlet. James has rightly articulated that people are finding outlets in their jobs. I would just say I don't think people see, and this is, Marianne pointed to people not trusting in politics. I think that's exactly right. But I think we have to directly tackle that problem, because if people are not engaging in partisan politics, and by the way, partisan politics is all we got. So if people aren't engaging in that partisan process, if people are tuning politicians or politics out in general, if people are saying, does it really matter, they're all the same, that's a real problem, because there are direct consequences. Politics is the answer to these collective action problems, and the answer is participation. So to anyone listening, I mean, if you care about these challenges, the only answer in the end, if you want to make the biggest difference, and especially if you want to push back so the pendulum doesn't swing at all, or the pendulum doesn't certainly swing as hard as it's likely to swing, the answer is to engage in politics. Whatever that politics might look like for you, the answer is to engage in politics. And I do think, we are seeing a lot of progress. That's important. But if we are going to maintain that progress, if we're going to build on that progress, it all tracks back to politics in the end. And people have to see themselves in politics and see themselves participating in politics to ensure that we realize as much promise as we can from our democracy and from those processes.
Marianne, I'm going to give you the last word.
Okay, sounds good. I did want to quickly add. So I know that both Nate and James mentioned the increased engagement in youth activism with regard to climate change, and of course, it's definitely a positive aspect or a positive success story. And I think that the main reason why there's so much more youth engagement is because it directly impacts us. We know that this is going to be our future. These are going to be the problems that we're going to have to be addressing head on, and for the foreseeable future. And so in most of our projects that I'm specifically doing, I do take into consideration the climate impact. And so, for instance, in my own NGO, I try to be as climate responsible as possible by donating reusable and sustainable products, by not relying on printing papers, and even limiting the carbon emissions that go into my projects by not flying directly to these locations. And so, yes, there is youth engagement, but I think we have to realize why it is, and also to increase participation of youth voices in important decision making.
Okay. Well, I want to thank all of you. for your participation today. It's been very intriguing, and you've all contributed in some wonderful ways. So thank you very, very much. I also want to thank the staff at Massey who make this possible. Joe, who's our technical stuff, and Alicia does a lot of the background stuff. And I really want to thank them for the really hard, good work they do to make these things happen. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Don.